Catskin by the Brothers Grimm. There was once a king, whose queen had hair of the purest gold, and was so beautiful that her match was not to be met with on the whole face of the earth. But this beautiful queen fell ill, and when she felt that her end drew near, she called the king to her and said, "Promise me that you will never marry again, unless you meet with a wife who is as beautiful as I am, and who has golden hair like mine." Then when the king in his grief promised all she asked, she shut her eyes and died. But the king was not to be comforted, and for a long time never thought of taking another wife. At last, however, his wise men said, "This will not do. The king must marry again, that we may have a queen." So messengers were sent far and wide to seek for a bride as beautiful as the late queen. But there was no princess in the world so beautiful, and if there had been, still there was not one to be found who had golden hair. So the messengers came home, and had had all their trouble for nothing. Now the king had a daughter, who was just as beautiful as her mother, and had the same golden hair. And when she was grown up, the king looked at her and saw that she was just like his late queen. Then he said to his courtiers, "May I not marry my daughter? She is the very image of my dead wife. Unless I have her, I shall not find any bride upon the whole earth, and you say there must be a queen." When the courtiers heard this, they were shocked, and said, "Heaven forbid that a father should marry his daughter. Out of so great a sin no good can come." And his daughter was also shocked, but hoped the king would soon give up such thoughts. So she said to him, "Before I marry anyone, I must have 3 dresses. One must be of gold, like the sun, another must be of shining silver, like the moon, and a third must be dazzling as the stars. Besides this, I want a mantle of 1,000 different kinds of fur put together, to which every beast in the kingdom must give a part of his skin." And thus she thought he would think of the matter no more. But the king made the most skillful workmen in his kingdom weave the 3 dresses, one golden like the sun, another silvery like the moon, and a third sparkling like the stars. And his hunters were told to hunt out all the beasts in his kingdom, and to take the finest fur out of their skins, and thus a mantle of 1,000 furs was made. When all were ready, the king sent them to his daughter, but she got up in the night when all were asleep, and took 3 of her trinkets, a golden ring, a golden necklace, and a golden brooch, and packed the 3 dresses of the sun, the moon, and the stars up in a nutshell, and wrapped herself up in the mantle made of all sorts of fur, and besmeared her face and hands with soot. Then she threw herself upon heaven for help in her need, and went away, and journeyed on the whole night, till at last she came to a large wood. And she was very tired. She sat down herself in the hollow of a tree, and soon fell asleep, and there she slept on till it was midday. Now the king to whom the wood belonged was hunting in it. His dogs came to the tree, and began to snuff about, and run round and bark. "Look sharp," said the king to the huntsman, "and see what sort of game lies there." And the huntsman went up to the tree, and when they came back again, said, "In the hollow tree there lies the most wonderful beast, such as we never saw before. Its skin seems to be of 1,000 kinds of fur, but there it lies fast asleep." "See," said the king, "if you can catch it alive, and we will take it with us." So the huntsman took it up, and the maiden awoke and was greatly frightened, and said, "I am a poor child that has neither father nor mother left. Have pity on me and take me with you." Then they said, "Yes, Miss Catskin, you will do for the kitchen. You can sweep up the ashes and do things of that sort." So they put her into the coach and took her home to the king's palace. Then they showed her a little corner under the staircase, where no light of day ever peeped in, and said, "Catskin, you may lie and sleep there." And she was sent into the kitchen, and made to fetch wood and water, to blow the fire, pluck the poultry, pick the herbs, sift the ashes, and do all the dirty work. Thus Catskin lived for a long time, very sorrowfully. "Ah, pretty princess," thought she, "what will now become of thee?" But it happened one day that a feast was to be held in the king's castle, so she said to the cook, "May I go up for a little while and see what is going on? I will take care and stand behind the door." And the cook said, "Yes, you may go, but be back again in half an hour's time to rake out the ashes." Then she took her little lamp and went into her cabin, and took off the fur skin, and washed the soot from her face and hands, so that her beauty shone forth like the sun from behind the clouds. She next opened her nutshell, and brought out of it the dress that shone like the sun, and so went to the feast. Everyone made way for her, for nobody knew her, and they thought she could be no less than a king's daughter. But the king came up to her and held out his hand and danced with her, and he thought in his heart, "I never saw anyone half so beautiful." When the dance was at the end, she curtsied, and when the king looked round for her, she was gone, no one knew whither. The guards that stood at the castle gate were called in, but they had seen no one. The truth was that she had run into her little cabin, pulled off her dress, blackened her face and hands, put on the fur-skin cloak, and was Catskin again. When she went into the kitchen to her work and began to rake the ashes, the cook said, "Let that alone till morning, and heat the king's soup. I should like to run up now and give a peep. But take care you don't let a hair fall into it, or you will run a chance of never eating again." As soon as the cook went away, Catskin heated the king's soup, and toasted a slice of bread first, as nicely as ever she could, and when it was ready, she went and looked in the cabin for her little golden ring, and put it into the dish in which the soup was. When the dance was over, the king ordered his soup to be brought in, and it pleased him so well that he thought he had never tasted any so good before. At the bottom he saw a gold ring lying, and as he could not make out how it had got there, he ordered the cook to be sent for. The cook was frightened when he heard the order, and said to Catskin, "You must have let a hair fall into the soup. If it be so, you will have a good beating." Then he went before the king, and he asked him who had cooked the soup. "I did," answered the cook. But the king said, "That is not true. It was better done than you could do it." Then he answered, "To tell the truth, I did not cook it, but Catskin did." "Then let Catskin come up," said the king. And when she came, he said to her, "Who are you?" "I am a poor child," said she, "that has lost both father and mother." "How came you to my palace?" asked he. "I am good for nothing," said she, "but to be a scullion girl, and to have boots and shoes thrown at my head." "But how did you get that ring that was in the soup?" asked the king. Then she would not own that she knew anything about the ring, so the king sent her away again about her business. After some time there was another feast, and Catskin asked the cook to let her go up and see it as before. "Yes," said he, "but come again in half an hour, and cook the king the soup that he likes so much." Then she ran to her little cabin, washed herself quickly, and took her dress out, which was silvery as the moon, and put it on. And when she went in, looking like a king's daughter, the king went up to her and rejoiced at seeing her again. And when the dance began, he danced with her. After the dance was at an end, she managed to slip out, so slyly that the king did not see where she was gone. But she sprang into her little cabin, and made herself into catskin again, and went into the kitchen to cook the soup. Whilst the cook was above stairs, she got the golden necklace and dropped it into the soup. Then it was brought to the king, who ate it, and it pleased him as well as before. So he sent for the cook, who was again forced to tell him that Catskin had cooked it. Catskin was brought again before the king, but she still told him that she was only fit to have boots and shoes thrown at her head. But when the king had ordered a feast to be got ready for the third time, it happened just the same as before. "You must be a witch, Catskin," said the cook, "for you always put something into your soup, so that it pleases the king better than mine." However, he let her go up as before. Then she put on her dress, which sparkled like the stars, and went into the ballroom with it, and the king danced with her again, and thought she had never looked so beautiful as she did then. So whilst he was dancing with her, he put a gold ring on her finger without her seeing it, and ordered that the dance should be kept up a long time. When it was at an end, he would have held her fast by the hand, but she slipped away, and sprang so quickly through the crowd that he lost sight of her, and she ran as fast as she could into her little cabin under the stairs. But this time she kept away too long, and stayed beyond the half-hour, so that she had not time to take off her fine dress, and threw her fur mantle over it, and in her haste did not blacken herself all over with soot, but left one of her fingers white. Then she ran into the kitchen, and cooked the king's soup, and as soon as the cook was gone, she put the golden brooch into the dish. When the king got to the bottom, he ordered Catskin to be called once more, and soon saw the white finger, and the ring that he had put on it whilst they were dancing. So he seized her hand, and kept fast hold of it, and when she wanted to loose herself and spring away, the fur cloak fell off a little on one side, and the starry dress sparkled underneath it. Then he got hold of the fur and tore it off, and her golden hair and beautiful form were seen, and she could no longer hide herself. So she washed the soot and ashes from her face, and showed herself to be the most beautiful princess upon the face of the earth. But the king said, "You are my beloved bride, and we will never more be parted from each other." And the wedding feast was held, and a merry day it was, as ever was heard of or seen in that country, or indeed in any other. End of Catskin by the Brothers Grimm. The Straw, the Coal, and the Bean by the Brothers Grimm. In a village dwelt a poor old woman, who had gathered together a dish of beans and wanted to cook them. So she made a fire on her hearth, and that it might burn the quicker, she lighted it with a handful of straw. When she was emptying the beans into the pan, one dropped without her observing it, and lay on the ground beside the straw, and soon afterwards a burning coal from the fire leapt down to the two. Then the straw began and said, "Dear friends, from whence do you come here?" The coal replied, "I fortunately sprang out of the fire, and if I had not escaped by sheer force, my death would have been certain. I should have been burnt to ashes." The bean said, "I too have escaped with a whole skin, but if the old woman had got me into the pan, I should have been made into broth without any mercy, like my comrades." "And would a better fate have fallen to my lot?" said the straw. "The old woman has destroyed all my brethren in fire and smoke. She seized 60 of them at once, and took their lives. I luckily slipped through her fingers." "But what are we to do now?" said the coal. "I think," answered the bean, that as we have so fortunately escaped death, we should keep together like good companions, and lest a new mischance should overtake us here, we should go away together and repair to a foreign country. The proposition pleased the two others, and they set out on their way together. Soon, however, they came to a little brook, and as there was no bridge or foot-plank, they did not know how they were to get over it. The straw hit on a good idea and said, "I will lay myself straight across, and then you can walk over me as on a bridge." The straw therefore stretched itself from one bank to the other, and the coal, who was of an impetuous disposition, tripped quite boldly on to the newly built bridge, but when she had reached the middle, and heard the water rushing beneath her, she was after all afraid, and stood still, and ventured no farther. The straw, however, began to burn, broke in 2 pieces, and fell into the stream. The coal slipped after her, hissed when she got into the water, and breathed her last. The bean, who had prudently stayed behind on the shore, could not but laugh at the event, and was unable to stop, and laughed so heartily that she burst. It would have been all over with her likewise, if, by good fortune, a tailor who was traveling in search of work had not sat down to rest by the brook. As he had a compassionate heart, he pulled out his needle and thread, and sewed her together. The bean thanked him most prettily, but as the tailor used black thread, all beans since then have a black seam. End of The Straw, the Coal, and the Bean. BRIAR Rose by the Brothers Grimm. A king and queen, once upon a time, reigned in a country a great way off, where there were in those days fairies. Now this king and queen had plenty of money, and plenty of fine clothes to wear, and plenty of good things to eat and drink, and a coach to ride out in every day. But though they had been married many years, they had no children, and this grieved them very much indeed. But one day, as the queen was walking by the side of the river, at the bottom of the garden, she saw a poor little fish that had thrown itself out of the water, and lay gasping and nearly dead on the bank. Then the queen took pity on the little fish, and threw it back again into the river, and before it swam away, it lifted its head out of the water and said, "I know what your wish is, and it shall be fulfilled, in return for your kindness to me. You will soon have a daughter." What the little fish had foretold soon came to pass, and the queen had a little girl, so very beautiful that the king could not cease looking on it for joy, and said he would hold a great feast and make merry, and show the child to all the land. So he asked his kinsmen, and nobles, and friends, and neighbors, but the queen said, "I will have the fairies also, that they might be kind and good to our little daughter." Now there were 13 fairies in the kingdom, but as the king and queen had only 12 golden dishes for them to eat out of, they were forced to leave one of the fairies without asking her. So 12 fairies came, each with a high red cap on her head, and red shoes with high heels on her feet, and a long white wand in her hand. And after the feast was over, they gathered round in a ring, and gave all their best gifts to the little princess. One gave her goodness, another beauty, another riches, and so on, till she had all that was good in the world. Just as 11 of them had done blessing her, a great noise was heard in the courtyard, and word was brought that the 13th fairy was come, with a black cap on her head, and black shoes on her feet, and a broomstick in her hand, and presently up she came into the dining hall. Now, as she had not been asked to the feast, she was very angry, and scolded the king and queen very much, and set to work to take her revenge. So she cried out, "The king's daughter shall, in her 15th year, be wounded by a spindle and fall down dead." Then the 12th of the friendly fairies, who had not yet given her gift, came forward and said that the evil wish must be fulfilled, but that she could soften its mischief. So her gift was that the king's daughter, when the spindle wounded her, should not really die, but should only fall asleep for 100 years. However, the king hoped still to save his dear child altogether from the threatened evil. So he ordered that all the spindles in the kingdom should be bought up and burnt. But all the gifts of the first 11 fairies were in the meantime fulfilled, for the princess was so beautiful and well behaved and good and wise that everyone who knew her loved her. It happened that, on the very day she was 15 years old, the king and queen were not at home, and she was left alone in the palace. So she roved about herself, and looked at all the rooms and chambers, till at last she came to an old tower, to which there was a narrow staircase ending with a little door. In the door there was a golden key, and when she turned it, the door sprang open, and there sat an old lady spinning away very busily. "Why, how now, good mother?" said the princess. "What are you doing there?" "Spinning," said the old lady, and nodded her head, humming a tune, while buzz went the wheel. "How prettily that little thing turns round," said the princess, and took the spindle and began to try and spin. But scarcely had she touched it before the fairy's prophecy was fulfilled. The spindle wounded her, and she fell down lifeless upon the ground. However, she was not dead, but had only fallen into a deep sleep, and the king and queen, who had just come home, and all their court, fell asleep too, and the horses slept in the stable, and the dogs in the court, the pigeons on the housetop, and the very flies slept upon the walls. Even the fire on the hearth left off blazing, and went to sleep. The jack stopped, and the spit that was turning about with a goose upon it for the king's dinner stood still, and the cook, who was at that moment pulling the kitchen boy by the hair to give him a box on the ear for something he had done amiss, let him go, and both fell asleep. A large hedge of thorns soon grew round the palace, and every year it became higher and thicker, till at last the old palace was surrounded and hidden, so that not even the roof or the chimneys could be seen. But there went a report through all the land of the beautiful, sleeping BRIAR Rose, for so the king's daughter was called, so that, from time to time, several kings' sons came and tried to break through the thicket into the palace. This, however, none of them could ever do, for the thorns and the bushes laid hold of them, as it were with hands, and there they stuck fast, and died wretchedly. After many, many years, there came a king's son into that land, and an old man told him the story of the thicket of thorns, and how a beautiful palace stood behind it, and how a wonderful princess called BRIAR Rose lay in it asleep with all her court. He told, too, how he had heard from his grandfather that many, many princes had come, and had tried to break through the thicket, but that they had all stuck fast in it and died. Then the young prince said, "All this shall not frighten me. I will go and see this BRIAR Rose." The old man tried to hinder him, but he was bent upon going. Now that very day the 100 years were ended, and as the prince came to the thicket, he saw nothing but beautiful flowering shrubs, through which he went with ease, and they shut in after him as thick as ever. Then he came at last to the palace, and there in the court lay the dogs asleep, and the horses were standing in the stables, and on the roof sat the pigeons fast asleep, with their heads under their wings. And when he came into the palace, the flies were sleeping on the walls, the spit was standing still, the butler had the jug of ale at his lips, going to drink a draught. The maid sat with a fowl in her lap, ready to be plucked, and the cook in the kitchen was still holding up her hand as if she was going to beat the boy. Then he went on still farther, and all was so still that he could hear every breath that he drew, till at last he came to the old tower, and opened the door of the little room in which BRIAR Rose was, and there she lay, fast asleep, on a couch by the window. She looked so beautiful that he could not take his eyes off her. So he stooped down and gave her a kiss. But the moment he kissed her, she opened her eyes and awoke, and smiled upon him, and they went out together. And soon the king and queen also awoke, and all the court, and gazed on each other with great wonder. And the horses shook themselves, and the dogs jumped up and barked. The pigeons took their heads from under their wings, and looked about and flew into the fields. The flies on the walls buzzed again. The fire in the kitchen blazed up. Round went the jack, and round went the spit, with the goose for the king's dinner upon it. The butler finished his draught of ale. The maid went on plucking the fowl, and the cook gave the boy the box on his ear. And then the prince and BRIAR Rose were married, and the wedding feast was given, and they lived happily together all their lives long. End of BRIAR Rose by the Brothers Grimm.